Final Fantasy VII is one of the most beloved video games of all time. It came out over 20 years ago, and many people have very fond memories of playing the game when they were kids. I am not one of those people. I have never played the original FF7, and I'm also not very familiar with the Final Fantasy franchise as a whole. The only other Final Fantasy game that I've actually played from start to finish besides this one is Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles Ring of Fates on the Nintendo DS, which I actually completed multiple times and is probably my favorite Nintendo DS game, although I haven't played it in at least 10 years, so I don't know how I would feel about it now. I have played a handful of other Final Fantasy games like Final Fantasy IV, Final Fantasy II, and Final Fantasy XIII, but I never got more than a few hours into them before putting them down and not picking them back up again. I think part of the reason for that is I'm just not really a big fan of JRPGs. There are exceptions, of course. I love Pokemon and Fire Emblem, but for the most part it's a genre that I tend to stay away from. Honestly, I wasn't even sure if I was going to play this game, but when the reviews came out, everyone was saying that the game was great and that it was a good introduction to the series for newcomers or people not too familiar with Final Fantasy. So I took a chance and decided to play it, hoping that it could be my way into the franchise. And while there's definitely a lot I did enjoy about this game, I don't think I can say I've been converted to a Final Fantasy fan. I played Final Fantasy VII Remake on the PS4 Slim for one playthrough on normal difficulty. This video is spoiler free. Most of the time the game looks great. Character models are incredibly detailed with fantastic facial animations. The hair does look a bit weird sometimes, but the animations while moving and during combat are stellar. They also took the time to lip sync the English cutscenes, which I thought was pretty cool, although they didn't bother to do that for the in-game conversations, which I can live with. The voice acting is also excellent in that melodramatic anime kind of way, even though all the anime grunting and sounds the characters make during conversations did drive me a little bit insane. The creature designs in the game are kind of bizarre. Like, you have your more expected enemies like soldiers and rats and shit, but then you'll come across a bunch of ninja turtles and be like, huh? Some of the creatures do feel out of place in the very industrial, urban, and facility-like environments that you explore in the game. That's not to say that they aren't fun to fight or anything, but it definitely took me a little while to get used to seeing things that really didn't seem to belong in Midgar from a purely visual standpoint. The game ran at a rock-solid 30 frames per second. There were occasional hiccups when getting in and out of combat, but 99% of the time the game ran basically perfect. And loading times are rare and not very long either. The environments themselves are for the most part pretty well done. There's lots of little details that when looking from afar give the impression of a lived-in world that feels quite tangible and realized. The lighting is great and the draw distance isn't bad. Unfortunately though, there are some very obvious shortcomings in the visuals that caught me off guard, considering how anticipated and hyped this game was. There is a lot of pop-in as you're walking through the various locations in the game. Whole crowds of NPCs will just pop in plain sight like they all simultaneously decided to drop their invisibility cloak. And when you move through the environment quickly, there are textures that take quite a while to load, longer than you'd expect. And there are whole areas in this game that just straight up look bad. There are textures that are either broken or, I don't know, just got overlooked or something. Like, I can't figure out why these textures look so bad. I mean, look at this door. I thought that the door was just taking a long time to load at first, so I waited to see how long it would take for the texture to load. But after a while I realized, oh, it isn't loading. It just looks like this. I haven't seen textures this low res since some of the early 360 and PS3 games. Like, this shit is really not good. Then there's the skyboxes or backdrops or whatever you want to call them. Most of them don't look very good. They're obviously just a picture that doesn't move when you move, and most of them don't really seem that high res either. But then I came across this one and I could not process it. I mean, seriously, what the fuck am I looking at? This is the worst background I've seen in a video game in years, like for real. Initially I thought that maybe they did this because you'll only be in this area for a couple minutes and they thought it was a necessary sacrifice or something. But no, you spend over an hour in this area. I cannot fathom what led to this being implemented into the final version of the game, but it's not acceptable. I think the last time I saw a background that looked like this was in the original Call of Duty from 2001, 4 years after the original FF7 came out. I'm trying not to be overly harsh or unfair, but this isn't some unknown indie developer that's developing their first game with a shoestring budget. This is Square Enix, a studio that's been making games for decades, remaking one of the most beloved video games of all time and one of the most prolific and longest running franchises in gaming with what I would assume is a pretty sizable budget. These kind of obvious shortcomings are unacceptable in my opinion. But again, just to be clear, I'd say 75 to 80% of the game looks fantastic, but that other 25 to 20% really sticks out. The game's music is utterly fantastic, an absolute contender for score of the year. I don't know how many songs in this game are remixed or reimagined tracks from the original and how many are new or even if there are any new tracks, but there wasn't a single track I heard that I felt wasn't good. There's a nice mix of more stripped down songs with piano or guitar while also having some very bombastic songs with strings and percussion and horn. However, as much as I liked the score, I did wish that there were more moments in the game where there wasn't any music playing, which seems a little contradictory, but the game was almost constantly playing music, whether in battle, out of battle, in cutscenes or out of cutscenes, and honestly it just became a little too much. You need time to breathe in game when it comes to battles and story, you know. Moments in between where you can just catch your breath for a little while, and the same goes for the music. I mean, despite how much I love my favorite albums, I wouldn't want to listen to them for 35 hours with little to no breaks. Final Fantasy VII Remake takes place entirely in a futuristic city called Midgar, which is owned and controlled by the evil Shinra Electric Power Company. You play as Cloud Strife, an ex-Shinra soldier turned mercenary who's been hired by what is essentially an eco-terrorist group called Avalanche. Shinra exploits a resource called Mako, which they use to power the entirety of Midgar. But Avalanche believe that Mako is the life force of the planet and that Shinra's reckless and greedy exploitation of Mako is literally killing the planet. So Avalanche is trying to put an end to Shinra. The best part of the story for me is absolutely the characters. I didn't really like the characters at first. It took a little while for me to warm up to them, but by the end of the game I was very invested in the characters and their relationships. I wanted them to succeed in their goals, and anytime I was separated from certain party members, I wanted them to return. I even felt legitimately sad when certain events happened to some of the characters. But the story does have issues that I want to talk about, specifically its pacing, its padding, and its actual narrative. At a certain point in the game, around the wall market section, I sort of had this niggling feeling in the back of my head that nothing was really happening to advance the story. I was enjoying the interactions between characters, but the game was beginning to feel almost like a massive prologue for the next part of the remake. And that was basically confirmed for me once I found out that the Midgar part of the original game was only give or take 6 hours long. FF7 Remake is not actually the entirety of the original game, it's only the Midgar part that they stretched and expanded to 35 hours or so. The rest of the original game will be remade and however many more parts of this remake there are. So yeah, they tried to turn 6 hours into 35 and it doesn't always work very well. As I said before, almost everything to do with the characters is fantastic, and the way that they've expanded the characters and their personalities and whatnot is done very well. I was shocked to discover that characters like Jessie, Biggs, and Wedge were basically non-factors in the original game, so to see how much love and life was breathed into them in this game is quite impressive. However, there were definitely times where I struggled to continue playing the game because there would be, say, an overly long exploration section with repetitive environments that have boring environmental obstacles, I won't call them puzzles because they're really not, that just drag the game's pacing through the mud. The game also constantly slows down your movement speed and places these sort of contextual transitional animation things that also slow you down, potentially to hide loading times, and it just became a real fucking drag at certain points. The side quests are also boring as all hell, like seriously, these are some of the most bargain bin bog standard side quests I've come across in a very long time. Most of them are your typical go here, kill this many enemies, then come back, and a few of them are even more boring than that, where you have to find a bunch of kids in a sector or find this girl's lost cats. I don't give a fuck about your cat, Betty. I have my own cat, and she's cute as fuck. There was only one side quest which I liked, which was one that resulted in an actual boss fight, but even that one requires you to trek through an environment you've already cleared before. The worst part about these side quests is that you can't do them on your own time. You can only do them when the game says you can. At 3 different chapters, the game will basically become a side quest chapter where you'll be able to do a number of side quests. But if you don't do them all at that point in the game, you will not be able to come back and do them later, at least not before you finish the game. So you're left with the choice of doing all the boring ass side quests at once or just not doing them. I cannot explain to you how much this brought the pace of the game to a screeching halt every time it happened. I did them all the first time to see what kind of side quests the game had, and I did them all the second time despite not wanting to, just to see if they got any better. But I could not be bothered to do them all the third time. I did like 2 or 3 and said, fuck it, I'm not doing this anymore. The only good thing about the side quests is that they allow you to return to the quest giver so that you can complete the quest without having to backtrack all the way back to the quest giver. It's a really nice feature that feels kind of out of place considering how much of your time the game usually likes to waste. Going into the game, I did know a little bit of what happened in the story. It's difficult not to when you're a serious gamer for any length of time to not be aware of some of the events of the original game, but I would say that I was still unaware of about 90% of the game's story. There was a certain element of the story that confused me because I had never heard anyone talk about this part of the story, and considering how much of the story seemed to be connected with this part of it, I found it bizarre that I had never heard of it. But there came a point in the game where I realized what was actually going on with this particular aspect of the story and the meta commentary that was happening, and I was like, oh, I don't know about that. Without getting into spoilers, the remake changes things about the original game and other tie-ins and spin-offs. Now, me being someone who has never played any of these games before, I don't really have a personal stake in what's been changed, but I do kind of have an issue with it on principle. I'm not saying that developers don't have a right to be creative with their creative endeavors, and some pretty key people who developed the original game returned to develop this remake, and you can tell that this game was absolutely made with a ton of love and care, and I don't think the changes that were made haphazardly or without thought put into them. Still, I just find it hard to get behind the idea of remaking a game that is one of the most beloved games of all time, that fans have been asking to be remade for at least a decade, only to not fully give the fans what they were asking for. I remember around the time this game came out, I was at work and I overheard a conversation between these two guys. I wasn't eavesdropping or anything, they were just talking loudly in the same area I was in. One guy asked his buddy what he was going to be doing on the weekend, and his buddy responded by saying that he was going to spend the whole weekend playing through Final Fantasy VII Remake. He said that he had remembered playing through the game as a kid and how much he loved it. He said that he didn't really play that many games anymore, but couldn't wait to re-experience a game that meant so much to him when he was a kid. And that's the biggest hang-up I have about this situation. This game means something to a lot of people, and when you remake a game, you have to respect that. I mean, at the end of the day, who are you remaking this game for? Well, it's the fans. It's the people who bought and played all the spin-offs, the people who watched Advent Children, the people who played through the original game a dozen times. They should be your #1 priority, not tweaking the story to be some kind of meta commentary on the nature of remakes. Now, don't get me wrong. Like I said, this game is still made with a lot of love and care by the developers, and I know that there are a lot of people who actually liked the changes in the story, and if you are one of those people, good for you, and I mean that. I'm glad you weren't disappointed. But I also know that there are a lot of people who didn't appreciate the changes, and I think those people have every right to be upset. Combat is the main focus on the gameplay front, aside from walking around and exploring. The original game had turn-based combat, while the remake has a real-time combat system crossed with a tactical pause feature called Tactical Mode. The way it works is that you use your basic attacks in real-time combat to fill up your ATB gauge. Once 1 or 2 of the gauges are full, you can then bring up the tactical menu to use items, spells, or one of the character's abilities. You'll have access to a party of 4 characters throughout the game comprised of Cloud, Tifa, Barret, and Aerith, with different combinations of the characters depending on where you are in the story. You don't get to decide who to take with you into battle, which kind of sucks, but I understand why they did it for story reasons. Each character has 2 different attacks that they can use without the ATB gauge, a standard attack like Barret shooting his gun arm or Tifa punching fools, and a heavy attack like Barret shooting an overcharged shot, or in Cloud's case a second style of attack mode called Punisher Mode, which severely limits mobility but increases damage dealt for each hit. Items are your standard affair with things like health potions to heal, ethers to refill your MP to perform spells, and other offensive things like grenades or explosive stuffed animals for some reason. Spells are dependent on what type of materia your character has equipped. Materia are essentially magical items created from the essence of Mako or something like that grants the wielder the ability to use whatever magics or spells the materia has been infused with. There are your straightforward elemental spells like a fire spell or ice spell, there's a healing spell, resurrection spell, and other spells that can slow down enemies and speed you up, or materia that can give you buffs like increased MP, HP, or XP. Abilities are specific to each character, and while some abilities are separate from the weapons characters are using, each weapon does have its own specific ability that the character can only use while wielding that weapon, at least at first. Each specific weapon ability has a proficiency meter, which will fill up as you use the weapon, and once it's full, you can use that weapon's ability without having to have that weapon equipped. You have a summon ability, which is tied to which type of summon materia you have equipped. Summons are powerful creatures that you can summon once certain conditions are met and greatly help you in battle. A summon meter will appear on the right side of the screen, and once filled you can use the tactical menu to summon your creature. The conditions for being able to use your summons is a bit vague and unclear. You won't be able to cast a summon in every battle. Summons only tended to appear in larger battles or in boss fights, and even then the summon gauge seemed to only fill up either once the enemy had been sufficiently damaged or I had lost a bunch of health. Once summoned, your summon acts as a friendly AI attacking enemies at its own volition. You can spend your ATB and activate your summon's abilities and special attacks to do more damage, and once your summon meter runs out, your summon will unleash an ultimate final attack that deals massive damage and then exit the fight. Each character has a limit break ability which fills up throughout the battle whenever that character takes damage, and your limit breaks can be used more than once in battle. Limit breaks are incredibly strong attacks or abilities that can deal massive damage and change the course of a fight, so knowing when and how to use your limit breaks can be the difference between winning and losing a combat encounter. Each enemy has a pressure gauge which fills up with each attack you do. If you use a type of attack that enemy is weak to, the pressure gauge fills up much quicker. Once it's full, enemies are staggered, meaning they are unable to move or defend themselves and take much more damage until the stagger meter runs out. Staggering enemies never got old, and it was always satisfying when I finally staggered an enemy and got to just wail on him. There's a lock-on mechanic which allows you to target specific enemies or specific body parts on enemies. I'm glad that the game has this feature, but it's a little bit more finicky than you'd expect. It isn't always intuitive in how it changes between targets. Oftentimes it would switch to a completely different target than the one I was actually trying to target. It's also unfortunately mapped by default to the right stick, which is also the camera control, so it can be quite annoying to have to realign the camera only to completely switch the enemy you're locked onto. FF7 Remake has a leveling system that's a little different from a traditional RPG, as your characters don't actually get increased stats or attributes. Rather, you use your SP to upgrade the various weapons that each character has. Each weapon has a few different cores, with each core having multiple stat boosts and buffs that you can choose from to upgrade, and each core has a different amount of SP required for each of their upgrades. Bigger and better upgrades will obviously require more SP, so you can choose to specialize one weapon for cloud and pure attack power and another weapon in magic attack power and switch between them when appropriate. This is a very interesting system with a lot of choice, and thankfully you can reset your SP at any time throughout the game if you'd like to respec a weapon. You can also equip accessories and armor that give you different abilities and stat boosts. Each part of what your character has equipped, be it accessories, armor, or weapons, has a certain number of materia slots that control how many materia that character can have equipped. There are some things about the game's combat that I found annoying and not to my liking. Some of these things may be things that are staples of the series and things that fans enjoy about the series, and that's cool. I'm not saying you can't enjoy these things, but I am saying that I didn't really enjoy them. It seems like the enemy AI is programmed to target whichever character is being controlled by the player. More often than not, whenever I switched to a different character, the enemies would quickly change gears and come after the character I was now controlling, even before I actually attacked them. I'm sure this was meant to encourage players to actively switch between characters and utilize the entirety of your party, which is a goal I can get behind. But in some fights this just resulted in whatever character I was controlling being steamrolled by a bunch of enemies. Then once I switched to a different character to try and spread out the enemies and support my previous character, the character I switched to was also steamrolled just like the last one. It could get a little frustrating. You get access to a special materia called Assess pretty early on in the game. What this materia allows you to do is to assess the weaknesses and resistances of each enemy and creature you battle, so you can learn what spells and weapons to use against it. It's a cool mechanic that can definitely give you an advantage in combat. However, it has one major flaw that really ground my gears a little bit. For whatever reason, you cannot change your equipment mid-fight, meaning if you don't already know the resistances and weaknesses of the monster you're fighting, well, too bad, you're just gonna have to deal with whatever stuff you have equipped before the fight. This isn't so bad when it comes to fighting the standard creatures in the game, as you'll probably be fighting most of them more than once, so when you come across them you can prepare ahead of time and change out your weapons and materia accordingly. But for boss fights, you either have to use your assessed materia against them, then reload a save or checkpoint before the boss fight, change out your equipment and materia and start fighting the boss again, or just suck it up and fight the boss with a potentially disadvantageous loadout. It's a pretty strange oversight. There are no mid-boss fight checkpoints, which can be a real pain in the ass because some of these boss fights are incredibly long thanks to a frankly ridiculous amount of health some bosses tend to have, making it to the final stage of the boss fight only to be killed in some bullshit way thanks to a cheap new attack that I had no way of knowing about, only to have to restart the fight from the very beginning is a level of frustration I haven't felt in a while playing games. Another thing that doesn't help are unskippable cutscenes that play during these boss fights to signify a transition to the next stage of the fight. Having to rewatch these goddamn cutscenes again and again on a fight you're having trouble with is incredibly irritating. This game was not the way into the franchise that I was hoping it would be for me. I'm not really interested in playing Final Fantasy XVI after finishing this game, for instance, or any of the other ones, to be honest. As for the game itself, FF7 Remake does have a lot to like about it. It's generally a great looking game with fantastic characters and a pretty deep combat system with a lot of options and flexibility. But I can't deny the obvious and blatant visual shortcomings in some areas of the game, along with a bunch of padding and filler in the story that resulted in some very uneven pacing, which caused some parts of the game to be quite frustrating to get through, as well as a few niggling issues with the combat system. It's not a bad game at all, but I don't think it's an amazing game either. And just a reminder, this game was me trying something that's a little out of my wheelhouse, so take this review for what it's worth. I'm going to give Final Fantasy VII Remake a 7.5 out of 10. I really wish that I liked this game more than I did, because Final Fantasy is such a long-running and beloved franchise, and I wanted in on that. Unfortunately, this wasn't it, Chief. I do want to play the next part of the remake as long as it gets good reviews. If people say that the next part is nowhere near as good as this one, I think I might skip it. If you liked this video, then please consider leaving a like, subscribing, and commenting your thoughts on the game. Thanks for watching.